Well, before we begin our study, our continued study through the book of Luke, I received an Ask the Pastor question, which I like to give priority. Actually, I got this one a few weeks ago, but with the film festival updates and then hearing from Jacob and Jonah last week, I put it off till today. So the question is this. In 2 Samuel 24, why is God offended that David took a census of the people? I don't understand why that was wrong. Would you mind explaining that? Anybody else have that question? It's a good one. I think all of us have asked that when you read that in 2 Samuel. And it's a tough question. It actually has a pretty complicated answer. But in short, God is the one who must call for a census of Israel, like he did in the book of Numbers. God actually said, hey, I want you to count the people for this reason. Actually, they were counted numerous times for various reasons, and it was God who was commanding it to be done. For David to just call a census without God asking him to do it kind of shows a lack of trust in God's plans and kind of shows David's own ambitious plans. Like he's counting how many warriors he has, and so that's part of it. What's interesting is that even his commander, Joab, who is not a good guy, when you read the story, Joab's not a great guy. He's a good warrior, but when David tells him to go do this, Joab actually says, no way, you shouldn't do this. He actually tries to talk David out of it, and of all people, to have Joab, a not so great guy, believing that this would be an offense to God, tells us that David knew better. But David was the king. He was a sovereign king. He was in a moment, and he dismisses even what Joab says, and because he doesn't have to listen to anybody, but he would have to answer to God, which he does. Now, I mentioned this is a more complicated answer than that. That's the gist of why it was wrong for him to do a census. But it becomes more complicated because this story is told again in 1 Chronicles. And so we have another account of the story. And it says in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So David said to Joab and to the leaders of the people, go number Israel from Beersheba to Dan and bring the number of them to me that I may know. And Joab answered, may the Lord make his people 100 times more than they are. But my lord the king, are they not all my Lord's servants? Then why does my Lord require this thing? Why should he be a cause of guilt in Israel? Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab. Therefore Joab departed, went throughout all of Israel, and came to Jerusalem. Then Joab gave the sum of the number of the people to David. All Israel had 1,100,000 men who drew the sword, and Judah had 470,000 men who drew the sword. But he did not count Levi and Benjamin among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab, and God was displeased with this thing. Therefore, he struck Israel. So that's the account. There's more to the story, but we see that it was Satan that actually tempted David to do this, and David gave into that temptation. And even though it was Satan who tempted him, it was David who was responsible and accountable for his own sin, and it did cost. Now, in the continuing the story, it's actually a story, believe it or not, of redemption. We look at this, oh, this is terrible, because God then brings a judgment against Jerusalem, the people of Israel. But there is a redemptive story behind this. And so as the story continues in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 14, God has sent out his angel. He had given David 3 choices. David chose one of those choices. God sends out an angel whose purpose is to actually destroy all of Jerusalem. That's how they're like. There's a lot here going. We don't have time for it this morning. There's a lot more going on that God would be this upset. So and it says, so the Lord sent a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. And God sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was destroying, the Lord looked and relented of the disaster and said to the angel who was destroying, it is enough. Now restrain your hand. And the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Then David lifted his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven, having in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. So David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell on their faces. So this is repentance. They're repenting. David's repenting and the elders are repenting. And David said to God, was it not I who commanded the people to be numbered? I am the one who has sinned and done evil indeed. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray, O Lord, my God, be against me and my father's house, but not against your people, that they should be plagued. Therefore, the angel of the Lord commanded Gad to say to David that David should go and erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So David went up at the word of the Lord, which he had spoken in the name of the Lord. So I know it's a little lengthy there, but I want you to understand that it was at this threshing floor of Ornan where the angel stopped from doing any more harm to Jerusalem. And then David was instructed right where he stopped, that's where you go and erect an altar. Now this whole story, you know why this whole story is told? The whole story is told is to give us the background of where the location for the future temple would be made. Because this is the Temple Mount. This is how God decided that is where I'm going to be worshiped, right here. So First Chronicles really goes on and it tells that story. As I mentioned, so David actually buys the property from Ornan. He buys the property outright. He owns it, but he dedicates it to the Lord as a place to build the temple. So there's more that could be taught about that, but it's not really the focus this morning. Hopefully that helps give a little bit of an answer to that really good question. All right, so now we're going to turn to Luke chapter 6. And we started Luke 6 last week. We had a wonderful week outdoors. I'm glad we're not outside today. It's a little chilly. So today we're going to be looking at this story of Jesus appointing 12 apostles. And so let's start in chapter 6, verse 12. It says, "Now it came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray, and continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Phillip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor." So this is one of 3 lists that lay it out like this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have lists of the apostles. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the 12 apostles were chosen because they had a special calling. And the number 12 certainly corresponded to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, all of these men weren't one from each tribe. It's just that they numerically represented the 12 tribes of Israel. In the book of Revelation, when John has his vision, when he sees a vision of the new Jerusalem, the city has 12 gates and it has 12 foundation stones. And the 12 gates have names on them, and it's the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. But these 12 foundation stones also have names on them, and guess who their names are? Specifically, it says the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So it was a significant role that they were being called to fulfill. And Jesus also told them later that these 12 would have a particular calling also as judges of Israel. It's a curious verse. Luke 22, we'll eventually get there, not anytime soon, but you'll probably forget it by the time we get there again. But Luke 22, verse 28, "But you are those who have continued with me in my trials, and I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Now, whether this is literal or symbolic is not easy to tell, but they are certainly singled out for some special purpose regarding In this case, he says judges on thrones. Now, the primary call, though, of these 12 apostles, which we will see, is that their main call was they were being appointed as the official witnesses of the ministry of Jesus, his life, his ministry, and his death, and his resurrection. That was their office. When we talk about an office, they were official. They were appointed for this main purpose, to be witnesses. And in fact, Jesus, when speaking to them, the 11, because Judas wasn't with them anymore, but after he rose from the dead and he meets with the 11, he said to them, this is Luke 24:46. We read it this week if you're following along in our Living Water Fellowship Bible reading plan. So this would have been something that came up this last week. He says, "Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And you," speaking to his apostles, "you are witnesses of these things." Now, you can say, well, how do you know it's not like more broad? Well, because when Peter is preaching to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, he actually relates this special call that they had. Acts chapter 10:39, it says, "And we are witnesses of all things which he did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they killed by hanging on a tree. Him God raised up on the third day and showed him openly, not to all the people, but to witnesses chosen before by God, even to us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead." So they had this special call. Now, the Apostle Paul, and we're not going to go into like his apostleship, but the Apostle Paul was an apostle, but he wasn't one of the 12. And he recognizes this. In fact, he himself, when preaching the gospel, he says in Acts chapter 13, verse 29, "Now when they had fulfilled all that was written concerning him, they took him down from the tree, laid him in a tomb, but God raised him from the dead. He was seen for many days by those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem." That was his apostles, "who are his witnesses to the people." So we see here that was really their main calling, was to be official witnesses of his life, his ministry, his death, and his resurrection. Now, that's a big deal. So how do you choose 12? He had more than 12 people following him. How do you choose 12? Well, we're told how he chose the 12. It says he prayed. In fact, he didn't just pray, he prayed all night. He sought God all night long. Luke 6:12, I'll just read it again. "Now it came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called the disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles." And who knows, maybe the whole night was in prayer over Judas Iscariot. Are you sure? Are you sure? Lord, Judas, I'm not sure about Judas. But Jesus shows us by his example that big decisions need to be submitted to God in prayer. And this is the thing, I love the example that Jesus gives to us, because if anybody could have a pass on praying about things, wouldn't it be Jesus? Wouldn't it be the Son of God, the Creator? Like, why does he have to pray at all? You know, he's the creator of the universe. He's the Son of God. But he became a man and dwelt among us. And as a representative of all mankind, he's like, no, men and women need to seek God. And I'm going to demonstrate this in my life, in my ministry. And so the one person who really probably didn't need to pray gave us the example of prayer and submitting to God in big decisions. And so we need to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. We need to not be willy-nilly about our lives. And this is part of the thing when it says, one of my life verses, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight." I don't know Anybody who really doesn't want God to give them a straight path, who's really seeking him, I think that we all want that. And he says, well, then acknowledge me. Acknowledge me in everything you do. Like, why go through life acting as if God doesn't exist? Why go through life acting as if it doesn't matter to him? Well, you know what? Many of you possibly, have either experienced this or are experiencing it or will experience that test where God will say, will you seek me? Will you acknowledge me? And he lets you, he watches and says, let's see what happens. So I'll just say 33 years of ministry, walking with the Lord, you hopefully learn a few things. I've learned a few things. I am a slow learner, I confess that. But I'm confident in this. And the sooner we can learn it, the better. Is that you need to acknowledge God in every circumstance, even the tough ones. But even so, especially when things are going well. It's interesting. I just about a week ago, I'm like, Lord, things are going well. I know they always won't go well, In fact, sometimes I brace myself when things are going well. Do you do that? You're like, oh, things are just going well. I gotta brace myself because, this is not a given that things are going well. But when things are going well, you know what I do? I just heap acknowledgement upon God for things going well. I said, Lord, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to praise you. I'm going to lift up your name. I'm going to acknowledge you for all your goodness, all your kindness, all your graciousness, all your mercy. And Lord, I know that when all of that turns a corner, which it inevitably will, all the things that I'm saying right now are still true. They are still true. And in that, when things turn around, and you go through those difficult times, that I'm going to continue to acknowledge you, God. I'm going to continue to seek you and pray. And see, this is the test that many people, even in the Old Testament, Israel was allowed to go through. And they failed so many times because when things were going well, they're like, ha, I'm doing a good job. Look at me, what I can do, And they forget that it's God who gives you the ability to do those things. And then God says, whoa, pride. I hate it. I hate pride in man. Because why God hates pride in man? Because justly, God would have just after sin entered the world, just said, done. I think we'll just stick with the deer and the antler and the cute little bunny rabbits and the butterflies. Let's just let them have the planet because, man, you're my special creation. You've sinned against me. But you see, instead of God just wiping us all out, he has mercy and he shows grace. He knows our frame, that we are dust. And then when dust begins to rise itself up in pride, God says, I hate that. That's the one thing I just hate in mankind is how proud he is, how proud he becomes. And so this is a good example that Jesus humbled himself, and not only humbled himself to serve us, but he gave us the example of acknowledging God in all of his ways. And he doesn't even pick his 12 apostles without submitting it to the Lord all night in prayer. Now he gathers them after that night of prayer to appoint them, and we know that the group was larger because he has to pick 12. If he only had 12 and he's got 12 to pick, there would be no picking. It's like, well, I only have 12. I guess you're the ones. But he had more than 12 disciples that were following him, and we're not told how many. But I do want to say here, we don't know how many more there were, but there were two significant ones in that group who were not picked. These are two of my favorite guys in all the scripture, Matthias and Joseph, also known as Barsabas Justus. These two guys were there. They were there with Jesus on the mountain. They were there with the other 12. They were there following him from the beginning, from the baptism of John. And when the 11 were gathered in Acts chapter 1, and they knew that office, which was only for 12 people, one spot was vacated by the apostate and traitor, Judas. His name was not going to be on one of those foundation stones in the New Jerusalem. It had to be another name. And so being led by the Spirit, they said, we've got to set a replacement, and here are the conditions. We have to pick from those who have been witnesses, official witnesses, from the baptism of John all the way to his death and his resurrection up till this day. And when they looked at, however many, the 120 or however, they said, who have we got? And they're like, well, we only have 2. There were only 2 others that were present that whole time. And so Matthias and Joseph, and they did not, when Jesus didn't pick them on the mountain, they didn't just mope about it and slink away. You know, how many disciples did kind of slink away and just kind of drop off? So this is why I really love these 2 kind of unsung heroes in the scriptures, because Matthias and Joseph, and even between those 2, I guarantee you if they stuck it out, one was chosen and one was not to fill that 12th spot, they both continued to follow Jesus. I'm guaranteed, because they've done it up to this point. So they're special. And so Jesus didn't pick those 2 men on the day he appointed the 12. And we shouldn't worry about like what God is calling others. We just have to say, what has God called me to do? And I love that about them. They were like, no, we weren't. It wasn't that they didn't make the grade. It was that it just wasn't their particular calling. One of them it would be, but they didn't even know it at the time. So you just stay faithful. Just do what God calls you to do and be faithful to it. These guys are great examples. They're great role models of just being faithful. They didn't become disgruntled because they weren't chosen for that particular role. Now, apostle, the word apostle actually means someone who is sent, more in that sense of someone who's commissioned by someone who's greater than them. So they're an ambassador. So they've been given an office to represent someone else. And this was the special case that the 12 would hold. Now I want to look at their names, because there's actually some pretty interesting thing about the names. And this is what you get when you have a Bible geek for a pastor, you get to have a little sermon on names. And I'm unashamed of it. I think these things are pretty neat. If you don't, take a nap. I'll wake you up in about 5 verses, all right? Just don't be loud, all right? Okay, so here are the names. Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Phillip and Bartholomew. Verse 15 in Matthew 6, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's lists. The same list is given in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's gospel doesn't give a list, but he mentions several of these men. He mentions Peter, Andrew, the sons of Zebedee. So he doesn't even call, which is James and himself. He mentions Philip. He also mentions Nathanael, who's believed to be just another name for Bartholomew, because Bartholomew is actually like a surname. It means son of Talmai. And so it's believed that Nathanael was, so it was probably Nathanael, son of Talmai, or Bartholomew. Then he mentions Thomas and Judas Iscariot. But even though John doesn't give a list of the 12, he mentions the phrase, the 12, numerous times. So he talks about the 12, acknowledges that there were 12. It's interesting also that 11 of the 12 are also listed in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 1, after the death of Judas Iscariot. They're all together. And again, we get another list of the 11. Now, in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's actually a certain order that's kept when these lists are given. So Simon Peter is always listed first. So this is just something to note. It's not random when they list them. So Simon Peter is always listed first, and I'll let you take a guess. See if you know who's always listed as last. Judas the scariest, right? Yeah, that's right. Judas the scariest. is listed last. As kids sometimes hear that word, Judas the scariest. Yeah, so Judas Iscariot is always last in the list. Now, did you know that these lists are always divided into 3 groups of 4? So that's another unique thing. There's a pattern, and it's always 3 groups of 4 men, and the same name is always listed at the first of each of the groups. So Simon Peter is listed always as the first person of the first group. The names under the next 3 names are sometimes, moved around. But in the second group of 4, Phillip is always at the beginning of that second group, and the 3 names below him are sometimes moved around. And then the 4th group, it's always James, the son of Alphaeus, at the beginning of the 3rd group. Now, what's the significance of this? I don't know. I really don't know. Except that this is the way they listed it, It does seem that, out of these apostles, and when you read it too, it does sound like they're often coupled together. It's Peter and Andrew, it's James and John, it's Matthew, and Jesus did send them out 2 by 2, so maybe there's some indication that was kind of they were also in couplets. But nevertheless, those are just interesting things. Like I said, you can wake up from your nap now. No, actually, we have a few more things about the names. Really, I want to talk about the first 4. So Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Interesting disciples of Jesus because they are 2 sets of brothers. So Peter and Andrew were brothers, and James and John were brothers. But these 4 men, I'll just call them the Fab 4, they were all in business together. They were all fishermen, so they worked together. Now, what's interesting is we continue down, so that's the first 4. They're brothers, they're in business together, and all 4 of them are picked by Jesus. And then the 5th person on the list is Phillip, who is from the same town as these others. Not a huge metropolis, so they probably knew him, especially since they're all wanting to know and are watching for the Messiah. They're looking out for the coming of the Messiah. So that would definitely narrow the group of people in their town down to just however many. So, but Philip, the 5th person on the list, and then Nathaniel, who, as I mentioned before, is believed to be Bartholomew, was a friend of Philip. So now you have the first 6 out of the 12. They're all really kind of a tight group already before God calls them. And then there's Matthew, the next one, the 7th one listed. Well, Matthew was a tax collector in their town. They all knew Matthew. And they probably all didn't like Matthew as a tax collector until he began to follow Jesus. So that definitely was the shocker for the group as Jesus was calling them, because he had already called at least the other 4 and probably the other 2. And who knows, maybe this is the order in which Jesus called them. We don't know how that all went. It's believed historically that Peter was the oldest of all of them. It's interesting because at the film festival we had this showcase screening of this film called Light of the World, which is a children's film. So it's an animated children's film about the life of Jesus. One of the things that kind of, as I was talking with people, they were kind of like scratching their head about, wow, they kind of present John as like around 13 years old. And all the others is definitely older. And they were like, well, part of that was they're trying to tell a story that relates to children. We're not told how old they were. I don't know. John might not have been 13. He probably was older. But historically, it's believed he was the youngest. And it's believed that only Peter was probably the only one of these that was actually over the age of 20. And you may think, well, where do you get that? Well, I'll just encourage you to sometime, if you get a chance, to go listen to some teachings by Ray Vanderlaan. He has a ministry, used to be called Follow the Rabbi. And then over the last many years, he's partnered with Focus on the Family. And so he studied basically under rabbis in Jerusalem as a Christian and wanting to learn more about just the culture and the history of discipleship. And so he points out things, some little breadcrumbs that we find in scriptures that may point to Peter being the only one over the age of 20 and the rest of them being younger. And if John's the youngest, though, he's pretty young. So you know what encourages me about this is seeing all you young people here. How many are like close to 13 or at least 13, all right? Or close. You're 12 and a half. Or maybe you're like 11 and 3/4. That's close to 13, you know. So, you know, and you think, wow. But it's very possible that these apostles of Jesus were relatively young. They were not old guys. They weren't like me or like your parents. They were young. They were cool, you know. And so, you know, they're great role models. So when you're reading the Gospels for you younger ones, yeah, ponder that. Think about that. Like, wow, they were young and they were following Jesus. Mary, the mother of Jesus, very young, possibly 15 or 16 years old. So, yeah, so God doesn't have any, you know, he's not looking at your age. He's looking at your heart. And even at a young age, you can be devoted to following Jesus. And so these apostles, they might have all been pretty young. Now, another thing about the names here, okay, we were talking about Matthew. It's interesting in Mark, Matthew is also referred to as Levi, the son of Alphaeus. Levi, the son of Alphaeus. I don't know, were you paying attention? There was another disciple who was also the son of Alphaeus. So James, the son of Alphaeus, the leader of group 3, who's always at the leading name, he was James, son of Alphaeus. So we're not told, was James, the son of Alphaeus, a brother with Matthew? Or did they both have dads with the same name? Maybe Alphaeus is just a super common name. If so, like, how come none of you have named your boys Alphaeus? Come on. It's a Bible name. You call him Alf for short, right? You know? Alphaeus. So who knows? Maybe Alphaeus was so common. But if it wasn't, then it's actually, you know, it's something to consider that they might even been brothers. Now you have 3 sets of brothers. All right, so the main thing is that when Jesus initially calls these men, and we've already looked at some of those stories like Peter and Andrew, James and John, what are the words that Jesus often uses when he calls them? What does he say? Anybody know? You're also quiet. It's 2 words. 2 words. I'll give you a hint. There you go. Follow me. Those are like often repeated. That's what he just goes up to Matthew in the tax office. And what does he say? Matthew, follow me. He comes to the fishermen and he says, you know, come, follow me. Then he says, I'll make you fishers of men. But the main thing was, come follow me. And if you look at that, you could do a search on that, and you can find that most of these men, Jesus just came up to them and said, follow me. And he meant it literally. They were literally to like drop what they were doing, which is exactly what Matthew did. He left the tax office, and it's like he followed Jesus. I love it when the first two disciples early on encountered Jesus, the disciples of John, and they're like, you know, they ask him, where are you going? Come and see. Which is essentially, come and follow me. You can just tag along. Keep your eyes open. See what you might learn on the way. And they did it. The sad thing, though, is there are stories of some people who some of them that wanted to follow Jesus, but Jesus tells them, do you really know what you're getting into? Because it's not easy. And he lets them know the difficulty of it, and some of them kind of walk away. Others, actually, there's one encounter where Jesus told a man, follow me. But once he saw the conditions of just dropping everything and following Jesus at that moment, he didn't do it. Not everybody was called to literally follow Jesus when he walked this planet. That was for a select group of people. Now, many of them did kind of like chase after him, crowds of people, but they weren't following him from day to day, eating the meals, camping out with him. That was a smaller group of people. But we're all called in some sense to follow Jesus, but not in that way, not literally. So what does it mean? What does it mean to follow Jesus today? Because he's not here on the earth in physical presence, and if so, it'd be very hard to follow him if he was, because he's got a lot of people. He's got a lot of people who want to follow him. So what does it mean for us to follow him? Well, I love Matthew 28, which is the Great Commission. He says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." So Jesus said, I'm with you. Now, I'm with you always means I'm with you every day. I'm with you every day by my Spirit. But go and make disciples and teach them to observe everything I've taught you. So we know that following Jesus begins with knowing what he taught, and not just knowing it mentally, but that we begin to follow what he taught. And this is part of what it means to follow Jesus, to follow in his footsteps, to know as our master what he taught, how he called us to believe and to understand and to live that out. He says to observe these things, not just to know them, but to actually walk in them. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. But there's more. In fact, Jesus in Matthew 16, he says to his disciples in verse 24, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Now, we know here that he's not literally talking about crosses. At the time, Jesus used so many parables and metaphors. His disciples, a lot of times, were kind of scratching their heads going like, wow, what is he talking about crosses? And the denying yourself is easy enough to understand. It means you lose your life. Like, stop holding on to your life. Stop doing it your own way. Why don't you just let go and take up a cross, which means be willing to die. And he says, and then come follow me, because that's how he was leading them. He says, "For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" So following Jesus means denying ourselves. It means taking up a cross. It means humiliation. It means even death if required, although it's not generally required to follow him, but to be willing, and to also find salvation, to seek the salvation of our souls, not the gain of the world. That's a part we don't want to miss. So if you want to follow him, then you got to let go of trying to gain the world. Rather, gain salvation for your souls through Jesus Christ. Follow him. Now, all of this is here in Luke chapter 6. It's a lead-in to what's known as the Sermon on the Mount. So let's just read a few more verses here this morning. Verses 17 through 19 is kind of the segue to the Sermon on the Mount. And it says, "He came down with them and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits. And they were healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for power went out from him, and he healed them all." And then from here, it goes into the Sermon on the Mount, which I'll save till next week, but we'll talk about this little transition period here. So it says he came down from the mountain and found a level spot, according to Luke's version of this. And otherwise, you might wonder, like, well, what happened? I thought this was the Sermon on the Mount. Isn't he supposed to be on the mountain? Well, We get that. It's called the Sermon on the Mount because of Matthew's gospel. And let me just read how Matthew introduces it. There were no chapters originally. So unfortunately, you have to look at the last verse of Matthew chapter 4 and the first verse of Matthew chapter 5 because they're connected. So I'll just read those together as if they're all like they were intended to be, all together. It says, "Great multitudes followed him from Galilee and from Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan. And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him." So it does look like, you might scratch your head and say, well, it doesn't exactly match up. But the other thing to know, we're not studying Matthew right now, but if we were, I would be reminding you that Matthew, when he teaches the Sermon on the Mount or any other like blocks of Jesus' teaching, he often takes several sermons and he groups them together in what's called discourses. And so he actually takes topical message of Jesus and he puts them all, squeezes them all into one block of teachings. So they weren't all done at the same place. So that may be one of the things here. But nevertheless, Luke just says that he was on the mountain. He comes down to a level place. So it doesn't actually say he left the mountain. He just found a level spot to sit. So it's possible that the level place was still on the mountain. I don't really get hung up on this. Those are the things that some people like to get hung up on because they distrust the Bible. I don't distrust the Bible. I don't distrust the story. This is a small little matter, it doesn't really bother me at all. But if you want to try to reconcile it, there are ways you could. But what's most important is what is the lead up to this sermon, if we're going to call it the Sermon on the Mount. And that is this great multitude of people who are looking to be healed. And it says, Luke also tells us they were looking to be healed and they were coming to hear him teach and to be healed. And what I love about Jesus is that we know his priority is to teach. So he has a priority to teach them because what he's going to teach them is going to affect their eternity. Feeding their hunger, healing their sicknesses, casting out demons, that affected them in the here and now, but it didn't make them disciples. Feeding people, casting out demons, and healing the sick did not make these people disciples. It would be through his teaching. And so he wants to teach them, but he doesn't he's compassionate. And when he sees the multitudes and they've come because they're sick, because they have demons, then he takes the time. He does both. He says, we can do both here. We can spend time, I can spend time healing. And he did that. So he healed people. We're not really given a description of how that works when you have a multitude of people, whether they all lined up, whether Jesus went around in the midst. It says he was, when he was teaching, he was sitting. But we do know it says he healed all of them. Anybody who was sick, who needed to be healed, that's what he did. But again, once he's done with that, then what does he do? He teaches. He teaches because it's going to be through his teaching that they learn about how their eternity can be transformed, not just their temporary life. And that was the focus. And even if people came just to be healed, they also got to hear him speak words of truth. And as I mentioned before, just being healed by Jesus didn't make someone a disciple. That's not automatic. Having a demon cast out of someone did not make someone a follower of Jesus, a disciple. Hearing his teaching didn't even make someone a disciple. Jesus said, which is in part of the Sermon on the Mount, especially very prominent in Matthew, is that the parable of the house built on the sand versus the house on the rock. The people who were building their house on the sand were people who heard what he said. They heard his teachings. But they didn't build their house by living by what he taught. That was what a disciple is, who didn't just hear the words, but began to follow his teachings and apply them to their lives. So his disciples were the ones who not only heard him, but they took his words to heart and they began to live by them. And that brings us back to the subject that I mentioned earlier about what it means to follow Jesus. Following Jesus. Not all the disciples were called to follow Jesus in the literal way, but we're all called to follow Jesus and to take up our cross. And this is the example that the apostles gave to us. And I think it's very appropriate because today is the first Sunday of the month, which is when we have communion. And communion is for people who are followers of Jesus Christ. And as a follower of Jesus, we obey what he taught us to do. And it's interesting, Jesus didn't give us many, like just religious things, but religion is not bad when it's right, and having observances when they're instituted by Jesus actually does matter, and that's why we do it. So we're gonna transition here, and I'll be leading us in a time of communion. So we're gonna invite our young men who serve us faithfully to begin to hand out. If you're visiting today, we have open communion. That means you don't have to be a member of our church, but you do have to be a member of the body of Christ. It means you have to be a follower of Jesus to participate in communion. We really leave it to the parents to make that call when it comes to children. So we leave that to you to decide what's appropriate, what's not. Thank you, John.